Hello and welcome to another episode here from sunny North Germany on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I am your host Niels Eichhorn, and I am joined today by a acquaintance for a while at this stage, I would say.
Yes,
And I think the first time we met was when I took students to North Carolina on a little trip, and we've met.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, I think we went to a Middle Eastern restaurant, if I remember, in Raleigh. So it was very good food, very good company. So today I am joined by Craig Thompson Friend. He is let me make sure I got this right. He is a full professor of history at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. He has been previously at the University of Central Florida, Georgetown College in Kentucky, and holds a PhD from the University of Kentucky. If I were to list all his books and his current seven projects, if I counted correctly, we'd be taking up all the time we have for the interview. But Craig has published quite a few things on Kentucky's history and also Cape
Yes.
Henry, the history of a summer camp in the Episcopal Diocese of Western North Carolina. But today we're talking about a book that came out with the rival school on the other side of the research triangle, Becoming Lunsford Lane, The Lives of an African American Aeneas, which came out with University of North Carolina Press. First of all, thanks so much for taking the time here just before your year-long sabbatical.
Thank you.
And how did you find Lunsford Lane?
Well, sure. Well, it's great that you mentioned our first meeting when you brought students to North Carolina because I ran the public history program at NC State, and some of the students were interested in that program, which is why we met. And being involved in public history, training grad students to work in museums and historic sites, automatically engaged me in sort of the local folklore of Raleigh. And Lunsford's among the foremost characters in that local historical lore that exists here. He was born in 1803, enslaved,
Mhm.
and his decision to free himself eventually resulted in him being attacked by a mob and tarred and feathered, which we'll discuss.
Mhm.
But that episode in 1842 really is part of the central lore of the city for the antebellum period. And so I ran across this guy's story. Then I discovered that he had a narrative written in 1842 that described all of this. And I read it and I became fully engaged in sort of parsing
Mhm.
what his life had been about in Raleigh. And more importantly, what happened to him afterwards, which up until 1863, there were pieces that historians had come across, but after 1863, nobody knew anything about him. And so uncovering his life story sort of became an obsession for a decade. Yes,
Oh my gosh, a decade. That's quite some time to be married to a guy like this.
it
Um,
is. Um, I mean, it's not unusual for an
mhm.
academic biographer to take 10 years to uncover somebody's life. And if you think about it, most biographies that are scholarly are rather thick. There's a lot of scholarship and research that goes into it. And so it just takes a lot of time. And with someone like Lunsford, um, a lot of that time is spent just uncovering sources because he's not someone, for example, like Frederick Douglass, who left a lot of writings behind that would help guide an author in trying to figure out his life. I really had to not only put all the pieces together, but go find the pieces. And that was probably the largest challenge.
Yeah. and I'm glad you kind of bring that up because it we're talking about a enslaved person here. So what was the most difficult thing to find about him?
Oh, well, it was sort of amazing that he isn't that hidden
Hmm.
in the sources because he
Mm.
was a rather prominent person and worked in a rather prominent household. And by prominent person, I mean somebody
Mm.
who was visible in the public even when he was enslaved. In Most of the power brokers, white power brokers in Raleigh, knew who he was. He even gained a job in the governor's office in
Mm.
1838 for about 3 years. So he's this prominent person, and even though he didn't leave records behind, he shows up in other people's records
Mhm.
and other people's diaries, and other people's letters.
Mhm.
Now, that's as an enslaved person. Once he's free, um, he's engaged in all sorts. There's my dogs. Are they bothering you? Okay. Okay. So to pick up where I was, once he became a free man, he shows up in all of these transactional records and
Mhm.
government records because now he's interacting with the populace at large. And so I found he purchased a piece of land in Raleigh in
Mhm.
1838. That land deed was very revealing to me about how much I could trust his narrative, which was the only source that you could sort of attribute to him. And to elaborate on that, the land deed shows that he bought the house for $53. And but in his narrative, he claims that it was worth $500. And so there's an exaggeration of financial accomplishment becomes part of his lore, which carries with him even to today. And for example, on historical markers, there's always reference to his entrepreneurship.
Mhm.
He may have been an entrepreneur in our modern use of the term, but he certainly was not in the way that term was understood at the time. And so, um, and so it became somewhat easier to find him in the records for at
Mhm.
least two-thirds of the rest of his life. But towards the end of his life, he was nearly impossible to uncover. And I really had to scrape through a lot of sources to even find one notice of him. So yeah, I think I was fortunate that
Mhm.
he was an enslaved person of some notoriety. And then as a free man, he was a public speaker and rather famous in New England. So I was lucky that I had someone who didn't necessarily leave his own sources behind, but still contributed and created a lot of sources. So I did not expect that. I expected it to be the challenge of writing the history of an enslaved person. But as a result of this, I also came to realize that the enslaved individuals in the South are in far more sources than we
Mhm.
assume. They just have to be uncovered.
Mhm.
And that's the challenge. You have to sit and go through 10,000 letters that a family left behind to find four notices, four comments about a person. So, yes.
The return on investment doesn't seem very good, but if you want to tell the story, you have to go through
You know
it.
what? I would totally agree with you, but I love researching.
Yeah.
It's a hobby to me, and I become
Hmm.
obsessed. Like most scholars, I become obsessed with things and go down rabbit holes,
Hmm.
right? And so I thoroughly, even though it was a long process, I thoroughly enjoyed every moment of it. And so, I mean, you know the thrill of finding a research gem
Oh yeah.
at some point, right? Oh,
Oh.
yeah. And that happened over and over again with this research. I was
And
surprised all the time by things I found.
yeah, and I think it's even more rewarding when it's so much harder to find that little gem.
Oh, absolutely. or when somebody famous mentions
Mm-hmm.
him. For example,
Right.
at one point he goes to visit um oh, I have forgotten his name, lived in Cambridge. Well, shoot,
We can
I've
probably look
forgotten
in
his
the book
name.
and look it up.
A great author, gosh, or a great poet. Um, well, I'll remember eventually. Sorry. Part of the problem with this book is there's a cast of thousands, basically, and so
Mm-hmm.
I can't keep up with all of them, and I forget their names. Um,
There's definitely a lot of different characters in there that just like and some really like you would expect famous ones like Garrison, right? Like he's there, he's front and center, but then also sort of characters that outside of a state history you wouldn't necessarily know about. And like
oh,
I'm thinking like the
sure.
guys that runs that hospital in Worcester in Massachusetts. Oh.
Oh, yes, Wellington. I mean, even in North Carolina, Lunsford's father is enslaved by the state treasurer, somebody most people have never heard of. But he was in power for 25 years and wielded a lot of power in the state. And so even among these sort of local or state level individuals who are quite wealthy, like Timothy Wellington or John Haywood, who have significant status, they have sort of slipped away from our collective memory of these locales, right? Um, and so what was actually sort of fascinating to me is how Lunsford pops into these
Mhm.
individuals' lives. I mean, not just William Lloyd Garrison, but also Frederick Douglass and
Mhm.
William Wells Brown, and this whole core of abolitionists, both black and white. Um, and his interactions with them made
Mhm.
them less mythical,
Mhm.
maybe made them, made them more human. For example, his first meeting with William Lloyd Garrison is when he tells William Lloyd Garrison his story of he's trying to raise money to raise his family, and Garrison takes him under his wing and tries to help him figure out
Mhm.
how to do that. But at the same time, William Lloyd Garrison is also creating an argument against purchasing enslaved people
Mhm.
as a tactic for the American Anti-Slavery Society, right? And
Right.
so theoretically, he opposes the very thing that he's supporting with Lunsford, and it's because on a personal level he can't say no, right?
Mhm.
Theoretically, he's opposed to it, but one on one, and this is
Mhm.
reinforced decades later when Frederick Douglass is finally purchased from his enslaver, and Garrison has been yelling for decades about
Mhm.
how we shouldn't be doing this, and suddenly
Right.
he's on board with it. And so, to me, it really humanized
Mhm.
individuals who sort of become mythical historical figures in the textbooks, right? Here's William Lloyd
Right.
Garrison, leader of the abolitionists. Um, but he's wrestling with his own
Mhm.
serious concerns over the process of abolitionism and over the nature of slavery in the United States. Frederick Douglass, who eventually comes to oppose purchasing enslaved people, Frederick Douglass stands up at his first meeting where he meets
Mhm.
Lunsford Lane and supports Lane's efforts,
Right.
and says, "Why shouldn't we help a brother who needs
Mhm.
this?" Right? Um, and so it really complicated and humanized
Mhm.
a lot of the people who normally are just sort of, historical figures
Mhm.
to us.
Yeah, and in many ways, that's the beauty of biography, that you have the ability through the person to explore so many different parts of history, so many different other characters, movements, and kind of they are not the textbook story that you're usually um, talking about or reading about.
Oh, absolutely. And I was trained as a social and cultural
Hmm.
historian, and that kind of history deals with people, but as
Mm-hmm.
groups
Yeah.
primarily.
Right.
Um, and so we sort of take a step away from the humanness
Mm-hmm.
because we're looking for generalizations.
Yeah.
And so this is the first biography I've written, and I'm probably going to continue to write biography
Yeah.
because it really allowed me to engage Lunsford as a human, as a
Mm-hmm.
person. And of course, I studied a lot about how biography is done,
Mm-hmm.
and professional biographers warned me before I even began through their scholarship that I would develop a relationship with him. And at some points, I actually thought he was the best thing that ever walked on the earth. And at other times, I'm disgusted by him. And in the end, I've sort of settled on the reality that ultimately I was disappointed in his life for him, and it didn't play out the way I'm sure he wanted it to.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I
but
definitely could
yeah,
see a number of those in the book.
absolutely,
Um,
yes.
but I want to go back to one of the sources you mentioned earlier, which is his narrative, his story, which
Okay.
he initially starts talking about in these abolitionist meetings where he's raising money, but then he's also publishing it. And I think it got published 3 or 4 times with different editions that it got published first where somebody wrote it for him, and then he went back and edited it for the second time, and then he went back and
Hmm.
edited again. Um, so and you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is myth, what's reality in that. Was that sort of something that you naturally felt like you needed to do, or was that something that people had taken too much at face value? Like how did this narrative become sort of the linchpin for the first well over half of the book to kind of be sort of the piece that you engage with as on a personal level with Lansford, but also on a scholarly level for your audience?
Well, I think the easy answer to that question is that it's the only thing I know that in which he inserted his voice,
Mm,
right?
right.
I mean, I have to believe that some of that narrative is his
Mhm.
actual voice, even though he didn't write it. He was not literate enough to write it the way it was written.
Mhm.
Um, but as I alluded to earlier, that land deed, the price of the
Mhm.
land really raised my eyebrow, and I began to wonder what else is exaggerated in here or what else is left out. I'll give you another example. Um, People who have been aware of his narrative, I think have assumed that his being asked to leave North Carolina via the law, for the legislature not supporting him, him going away and making money and then coming back to purchase a family was sort of him. But as I point out in the book, there are two other men,
Mhm.
Waller Freeman and Isaac Hunter, who go through the exact same process, and they go through it with Lunsford. Okay.
Mhm.
And why Lunsford doesn't include them in his narrative is an interesting question to me. Um, why aren't they part of the story he tells? And I think it's because the ghostwriter of his narrative, um, may or may not have known about them. I don't know if it's Lunsford or the
Mhm.
ghostwriter, but my sense is that the ghostwriter chose to keep the story focused on Lunsford
Mhm.
and to elevate Lunsford as this embodiment of trials against race and slavery in the South, right? But it does raise it reiterates the question about how truthful is this narrative or any narrative, right? Any slave narrative that was penned by an abolitionist, because certainly the abolitionists were attempting to choreograph
Mhm.
what former enslaved peoples were saying on the lecture circuits and doing in public. We know that from Frederick Douglass, who
Mhm.
complained about he didn't like being handled. Um, um, Lunsford also had a handler.
Mhm.
Charles Spear was assigned to him and accompanied him everywhere. Um, and I think that also played into the writing of the narratives. These
Mhm.
narratives were meant to make points, and um, And so his ghostwriter was making a point. But in doing so, and this is in doing so,
mm,
it sort of muddies the historical reality. And this was reinforced for me in the biography that was written of him in 1863 by yet
mhm,
another abolitionist, William Hawkins. Hawkins, who sits down with Lunsford and interviews him, and then basically just reiterates the narrative and editorializes about everything, right? So it's a really thick book without much additional information about Lunsford, repeating the same untruths,
mhm,
half truths, and some truths, right? And you have to wonder, ultimately, how did Lunsford feel about this? Now, you mentioned Lunsford did have opportunity to go back and edit the narrative before its second, third, and fourth printings, but he didn't do so substantially, minor changes here and there. And so, and you know, I don't blame him.
mhm,
He made good money
right,
off from the story that he told, both in print and on the lecture circuit.
mhm.
And so why mess with the moneymaker, right? And it doesn't stop being the moneymaker until the abolitionist movement begins moving in a different direction and away from him. And that's when his popularity wanes, and so does the income.
Yeah. You're opening an interesting door because I did want to talk a little about money because it's like you nicely chronicle when he's in the North lecturing, talking about his experience, trying to raise money to free his family, and you talking about like he raised $20 here, or he raised 20 here, 20 there, and like
Mhm.
it's not a lot of money that he is making, considering how much he needs to get to free his family. So I kind of like, how hard was this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was as hard as it was just demanding in time,
Mm,
right?
okay.
He just had to go talk a lot. And
Right.
he basically told the same story over and over again.
Mm,
Um, um, Anne Weston um, wrote a couple letters to her sister where she's like a groupie and she goes to multiple Lunsford Lane events and she's like, oh, he's telling the story again, right? And she's really into this stuff. Um, and, and
mm,
so he's doing this a lot. Now, he only does this for about 7 months total, if that.
okay.
And he does raise in that process, he raises $2,500 to purchase
Mhm,
his family. And so, part of the problem with the way I wrote that section, and I really appreciate your kudos for my attention to details there, is that I didn't have all the details, right? I didn't have every single event. I didn't know every event that he spoke at and all the money he raised from them. But he makes that money. Now, the challenge though for him is after he purchases his family and returns back to the North, he's never that financially successful again, right? And he's a free person with a family in tow, safe from enslavement, and his success just dissipates. And uh, and I'm not sure why. Uh,
mm,
I don't think he managed money very
mm,
well. He was foreclosed on mortgages and loans all the time, over and over again. He barely scraped by money to sustain his family.
mhm,
Um, you know, but up until that moment when he becomes sort of a poor household manager. Um, his economic success is sort of staggering for somebody
mhm,
of his status.
yeah.
Um, so, so,
Uh,
did I answer your question?
yes. Yes, you did. I mean, it just, I think in part it's the
Okay,
modern, in part
let's
I think
start
it's,
rambling down roads. Huh?
I think it's a modern mind too of like you're kind of like so I have this much, I pay that much for housing, that much for food, and you're kind of like mentally summing it up and you're trying to translate that a little into the past, and um it doesn't work that easily.
Oh, I think one of the personal lessons I took from this
Mm.
experience is to stop worrying about debt.
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sort of obsessed with paying off debt. Don't want credit card debt. The
Right.
mortgage is okay because it's an investment, right? But we're
Sure.
sort of obsessed with, in
Mm.
our society with debt because we're all rated, right, for our
Mm.
credit, and that
Right.
matters.
Yeah.
He lives in a time when there's no such thing as credit rating.
Right.
And um, all the men around him from when he's enslaved, the
Right.
enslavers, um, free black men he knows, they're all in debt.
Yeah.
And they all die in debt, and they don't
Mm.
seem concerned about it at all. And he seems to follow the same pattern. He ends up purchasing, I believe, 7 properties over his lifetime. Only one of them does he make any money off from.
Right.
One of the joyous research surprises I found, one of the aha moments late in my research is when I discovered that in 1865, when he returned to North Carolina and then went back to Worcester, um, his wife and daughters had purchased property elsewhere, and they end up making a profit off from that property. I
Yeah.
mean, they're far more successful economically than he is in their one venture. But he seemed unconcerned about the debt that he racked up over a lifetime. And I suppose I don't know this, and I'm unaware of any historians who have worked on this, but it's certainly something somebody should engage in is
Mm-hmm.
attitudes towards family debt, right? I mean, there have been some
Mm.
historians who have looked at debt at the company or corporate levels in
Mm.
as the capitalistic system was taking shape during this time. But I'm really curious if this was just the attitude of
Mm.
patriarchs generally, is
Mm.
that, you live your life, you rack up debt, no matter what your economic status, and you let your widows take care of it afterwards. And of course, this put widows in horrible positions.
Mm.
So, and some of whom had no qualms about selling property,
Mm.
enslaved in land to pay off debts, and others
Mm.
who were horrified
Mm.
that they had to sell off enslaved people to pay off debts. So yeah, well, yeah, it
Yeah.
was just sort of shocking to me
Mm-hmm.
that was his attitude.
Mm.
And I mean, and it's clear that it's purposeful because
Mm.
on at least 2 occasions, he sort of sneaks the family out of the house and abandons the property because he knows it's going to be foreclosed upon. And so they just dart out of town.
Yeah, that was like
So
Cambridge. What was that town called there? Cambridgeport, right? Where he kind of
Cambridgeport.
leaves for
Yes.
Oberlin and it's not just I disappear. And the landlord is like, no one's been
Oh,
here.
yes. And that property specifically he had taken what we would call second mortgages out, two, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he actually had 3 people who now had to go to court to fight over, after he abandoned it, to fight over who should get some money out of it.
Yeah.
And, and this was not my purpose, but it really piqued my interest um,
Mm-hmm.
about how the capitalistic system that was emerging in the United States
Mm.
shaped individual lives, how it
Yeah.
played out at the household level,
Right.
rather than at sort of the industrial level, which is where
Mm-hmm.
we all look at it, the Industrial Revolution, right? But it really, I was really engaged in that sort of family financial crisis
Mm.
um, topic because I'm usually in that family financial crisis myself, and so I could identify with it. So, yeah.
Maybe a little too much information there. Oh,
So people should buy my book to make me
yes, buys a book, buys a
financially
book,
solvent.
and
Yeah, yeah,
assigns a book in class. Uh,
yeah.
so let's just, since we have been talking about him in the North for so much already, is that it's I think time we also go to North Carolina in your backyard because that's where his story really starts, and we should talk about him in sort of the enslaved environment because he's somewhat unique in that
Mhm.
too, because usually we think of enslaved and sort of plantation settings, but you have with Lunsford somebody who is in an urban environment.
Yes. And I think it's important to begin with both of his parents were in the same situation.
Hmm.
And so he's somebody who's born into a situation, right, that
Hmm.
he can take advantage of over time. Um, his father was a gardener
Hmm.
for John Haywood,
Hmm.
who lived on the south side of Edenton Street and drove a carriage and took care of the horses. His mother was the cook for Sherwood Haywood, who lived on the northern side of Edenton Street. So these were brothers, and two other brothers lived nearby who lived collectively in a neighborhood. And um, and so his mother and father, to my knowledge, never had a formal wedding, even after they both were free. But they were married quite early, and um, and they had Lunsford in 1803. From what I can tell, he learned a lot from both parents.
Hmm.
He learned how to take care of the horses and drive the carriage from his father.
Hmm.
He learned gardening from his father, which came in useful later on. He learned his mother was apparently a bit of an herbalist, and he learned how to concoct hangover medicines, for example. And later on, this plays into him assuming the role of a doctor, which I think we'll probably talk about. But he assumes the title doctor,
Hmm.
but he also takes on this role of being somebody who's sort of pharmaceutical in their work. And and I think all of that comes from the lessons that he learned from his mother and father. And so as he grows up, he's the only child who grows up enslaved on this town estate
Hmm.
of Sherwood and Eleanor. And as he comes of age, he's perfect for them to move into a more central role on the town lot, right? And I should point out that, where we have been trained intellectually to distinguish between urban and plantation
Hmm.
slavery. And and historians have spent decades distinguishing between the two. But almost every day of his adult life, he left that urban setting for the farm about 3 miles north of town that raised all the food for the
Hmm.
people living in the urban setting. And so he went up there and worked the fields. And so he's sort of this bridge
Hmm.
between these two worlds in which enslaved people often found themselves. Um, and a lot of those people who lived on that farm and worked on that farm came into town to go to church. And so I think the distinctions between those two categories has been drawn too rigidly, though the distinctions have been drawn too rigidly, and that we ought to look for more gray area, how those two worlds
Hmm.
blended into one pattern of
Hmm.
enslavement. Um, so, um, but yes, and because of his status, the son of two people who were heavily relied upon
Hmm.
on the estates where they lived, he sort of assumes roles that, as the
Hmm.
two of them aged, they could no longer do, right? And so he takes on roles. So eventually he's the carriage driver, um, and eventually he's the one who's making the money. After Eleanor's husband dies and she's stuck with all of this debt, he's the one who volunteers to hire himself out, right, to make money for her so that she doesn't end up selling enslaved people. And eventually he parlays that into allowing himself to hire himself
Mhm.
out, right? Let me do things to make money. And that's how he opens the door to raising the money to purchase himself. Not his freedom. He doesn't purchase his freedom. He purchases his body,
Mhm.
because that's all somebody could do in North Carolina. And then months later, he traveled to New York, where he received some emancipation papers from a county court. But that process, he carried that deed to himself, in his pocket, right? You it's sort of a tragic concept, really, really difficult to wrestle with, I think.
Yeah. Very quickly back to his herbal medicine, hangover medicine. Since you were just at Sheer and you
Sure.
know how much historians at conferences like to engage in drinking, have you personally tried his hangover medicine?
No, I don't have the recipe, but I also don't drink, so I wouldn't need it. But
Your friends
um,
would.
uh, I mean, I wish, wouldn't it have been fascinating to
Yeah.
find his recipe for hangovers? There are things, I will tell you, since you mentioned Sheer, I went to a panel and some afterwards, oh no, I ran the biography workshop, and afterwards one of the participants came up and said that he had discovered Lunsford in his own research, and he's writing a biography of William Miller and the Millerites, who believed that the end of the world was coming. And so he started telling me about where he ran across Lunsford. And and I do think now that Lunsford was at some point played
Mhm.
around with the Millerites and
Mm,
sort of got involved in that utopian group. Now, this is something I didn't run across in my research, right?
right.
And so after the biography's done, I find this fascinating piece of information about him. And I'm like, darn it, I would love to have incorporated that into it, because there's a point in the book where I talk about as a free man in the North, he's restless and looking
Mm,
for some meaning, right? And
yeah.
here's more evidence of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that's the worst part about doing historical research, whether it's biography or a monograph or whatever,
Yeah.
is that, you always find something afterwards that you're like, darn, that's really fascinating and should have been included. I need to do a second edition and pop it in there.
Don't
So,
I know? Don't I know? Yes. That's that's the most dreadful thing. Like the book just came out and you're like, oh man, if I had known this.
oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
And it's just fat. I mean, it boggles my mind that he
mm,
flirted with the Millerite movement, because his relationship with Christianity was, and he distrusted
mm,
Christian ministers so much. And then here's somebody whose whole philosophy relies on belief in the Christian Bible, particularly the Book of Revelations.
mm,
And Lunsford flirted with it, right?
mm,
And I'm really curious as to
mm.
how and why that came about.
Yeah,
I may explore it and write an article as sort of an addendum, right?
there you go.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking back to the book. It's been a couple of weeks since I read it. I like once you have him in the Norse, there isn't a lot of religion that you talk about.
He
Even
doesn't
though he
show
must
up.
be, yeah,
I mean, he joined the African church in Boston,
sure, yeah,
and but the only records that place him in that space are when he went to abolitionist meetings,
right,
and
right,
and so he's using that space for political purposes
hmm
rather than religious
right.
purposes. And there is I believe it's a picnic he attends where he
Mm,
says a prayer. But it's the only time I know that he says anything religious. He goes to the meeting of the American Bible Society in
right.
New York City, and
Terrific.
they basically say to him, "What are you even doing here? You know, you're laughing at things we're saying about
Mhm.
Christianity, about our faith, you
Mhm.
know," and he says, I'm here to ask for money to renovate the church I go to, right?
Mhm.
And it's more about this sort of practical application rather than faith. And so, you know, his experience with Christianity, and I trace this distrust of Christianity
Mhm.
back to when he was enslaved, and he had to take the enslaving family to church and wait for them. And so he stood outside the doors and listened to the sermons, and he hears Episcopal, and then he goes to the Baptist church. He hears Episcopal and Baptist ministers all the time um, preaching to their interracial congregations that enslaved peoples need to obey their masters
Right.
directly from the Bible, right? And so he grows distrustful of the messengers and the
Mhm.
message. Um, and um, and this is sort of, you know, this is interesting to me because one of the things that initiated my interest in the
Mhm.
project, again, was his public history and in
Mhm.
unraveling how he's portrayed in the public. You know, I
Mhm.
ran across W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about Lunsford
Mhm.
at one point,
Mhm.
and it's all about how Lunsford is a great Christian preacher. Okay. And then you look at Du Bois's sources, and none of them say that, right? And so here's this mythology that just
Mhm.
blooms out of I think a misunderstanding. I don't know where Du Bois was coming from to even think
Mhm.
that, but yeah, I mean, historians and scholars have been very loose with Lunsford's narrative and have made all sorts of grand claims for him that just are not accurate at all.
Yeah, this is especially being a pastor of some sort. Oh
Right,
my.
right. Yeah. But I
Um,
mean, I suppose if you find Lunsford in the records of the African church in
sure.
Boston, that you make an assumption that he's
Yeah.
an active person of faith.
Right. And you don't dig
But as we
deeper.
all know, churches aren't always about
No.
faith. They're
Right.
also about socializing and
Mhm.
political agendas and all sorts of things.
Yeah. And definitely nowadays and definitely at that time
Absolutely.
too. So,
Yes.
um, so let's also look at this interesting dichotomy that you have in North Carolina because the Haywoods seem to be terrible when it comes to money. Like really bad considering that his owner is embezzling from the state and has huge debt. And then you have Lunsford, who is just like every opportunity he gets, he's trying to kind of make a dime, like selling altered tobacco, like trying to get these legislators to kind of buy from him. Like he seems to be like the polar opposite of his enslavers.
I think too, well, I would
Financially,
agree
like
with that assessment, huh?
when it comes to creating kind of wealth, at least. And
Well, I would agree with that. He's a polar opposite because of his condition, right?
yeah,
I think thinking financially, he's not necessarily a polar opposite. I mean, the Haywoods, the enslavers, are trying to make as much money as they can.
mhm,
I think they make so much money that they don't think about it and they don't worry about it
right,
in the way that we would expect somebody like Lunsford to be
sure.
concerned, counting the dimes and
Hmm.
nickels, right? Um, it's not his enslaver who is eventually identified as embezzling from the state. It was his father's enslaver, which put his father up on the auction block
Yeah.
eventually. Um, and and so consequences for Lunsford, sort of. But John's brother Sherwood, who was Lunsford's enslaver, also is loose with the money. And these are guys that are handing out loans to their friends and other family members and not certain they're ever going to get paid back for that sort of
Mhm.
stuff. And both of those men leave their widows in a great amount of debt, right? Yeah, I also think Lunsford learned from John Chavis, who was the most
Mhm.
prominent free black man in
Mhm.
Raleigh. And I mean, John Chavis was so prominent, um,
Mhm.
and largely because he was an educator and he ran a school originally for white and black children, but eventually, because the white parents complained about their children being in the same room as black children, he takes the side of the white parents because they're the ones who are paying the most
Mhm.
money for the education, right? So he's willing to do what he needs to make money. He dies in significant debt in
Mhm.
his life. I mean, the examples are abounding in Lunsford's world for him to learn financial mismanagement, and that's exactly what he does. You
Poor guy. Poor guy.
know.
But we have to give him credit. He is really innovative in the different ways how he's trying to make little amounts of money, right? There's like
Oh,
it's
sure.
small
And
business.
yeah. Well, I push back against the concept of entrepreneur in his life, but I would fully embrace
Hmm.
the idea that he's an innovator.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and But I also think we need to be realistic about the world in which he lived.
Hmm.
This was a society that did not have long-term careers, did not have professions,
Hmm.
the way we conceptualize
Yeah.
professions. Um, the majority of people lived and made money the way Lunsford did, by
Hmm.
doing what they had to do to make money. And I think historians have shown over and over again that the average American during this time sort of changed jobs
Right.
multiple times in their lives because they're always pursuing the best opportunity to make a buck.
Hmm.
And that's what he did. He's chopping wood. He's taking really bad tobacco that's probably been thrown away by local stores and putting flavoring on it and then selling it as a good quality tobacco, right? With his father, I mean, his father is an innovator
Hmm.
too. His
Yeah.
father comes up with that process of flavoring tobacco,
Hmm.
hiding the Lunsford invents a pipe
Hmm.
that looks like an alcohol still. It has a tube coming out of it to release heat so people don't burn their lips
Hmm.
on the pipe. And Lunsford's putting drunk legislators to bed, and he's going to their rooms in the morning and giving them, a hangover medicine and helping them dress for the day. I mean, he's doing anything. He becomes sort of the go-to person for shopkeepers
Hmm.
in Raleigh who hire him to set up their window designs, to put things
Hmm.
on display in the windows. I mean, he's doing all of these
Hmm.
sort of odd, what we would call odd jobs, right?
Right.
He's doing all of these odd jobs to make money.
Hmm.
Um, at no point does he have a consistent job until he's hired in the governor's office in 1838. And um, and then he has this prominent job. He's a doorman. He's keeping people out of the council meetings that the governor has to
Hmm.
attend to. He's delivering documents all across state government. He's really sort of the visible presence of the governor.
Hmm.
Um, which, as you can imagine, irritated a lot of white Raleigheites who believed that a black man should not be part
Hmm.
of the governor's, team, and should not certainly not be visible. And um, and so then we begin to move into this area of racial resentment,
Hmm.
right? Here's somebody who, no matter what odd job he did, no matter what sort of innovative practice he comes up with, is an economic threat to white Raleigheites who are trying to do the exact same thing, sell tobacco,
Yeah.
sell hangover medicines, right? they're doing the exact same thing, and he's more successful at it than most. And then he gets this job in the governor's office, and this resentment, this racial resentment. And this is where I sort of push back against the narrative, because in Lunsford's narrative, he shows up and he is mobbed, and eventually tarred and feathered, because he that's how the abolitionist writer posed it. And I don't agree with that. I think it's more multi-layered than that. Yes, he's black, but he was also an economic threat, to the type of men who attacked him. And what's sort of fascinating is, so a mob of men grab him when he returns to North Carolina to, purchase his family, having acquired all of this money. And they take him out near the city gallows. He thinks they're going to hang him, but they sort of just dump him on the ground. They take all of his clothes off him and they tar and feather him. And in the process of that, there are men in this crowd who put their hands over his eyes to make sure the tar doesn't get in his eyes. And there are men in the crowd who hold his clothes for him and hold his pocket watch and protect his possessions, right?
Yeah.
And then after they do this ritual, they're like, okay, you're free to go. Enjoy your time in Raleigh, right? I mean, it's like we're best friends again. We hung out for years together, and here we are again, best friends. And then he goes to his family, and he's in the house with his family, and men from this mob come to the door and apologize for what had happened and their participation in it,
Yeah.
right? And it's just perplexing. You're like,
Yeah.
how serious were these guys who attacked him? And the answer is they weren't that serious about attacking him, right?
Hmm.
They're ultimately, and they come out and say this in the days following the event. Ultimately, they were trying to make a point to Raleigh and North Carolina's white political class, about, um, engaging black labor in the governor's office, about helping men like Lunsford and the other two men I mentioned earlier acquire their freedom, purchase their bodies. It's a class,
Yeah.
riot in some ways against the upper class, and against the upper white class. And yet, here's Lunsford who gets sort of sucked into it,
Hmm.
and takes the brunt of the punishment. But he's not the only free black man who does that. There's a free black man named Allen Jones who was a friend of Lunsford. And after this event, Lunsford and his family got out of Raleigh, but Jones was still in Raleigh. And a couple weeks later, a school that he had set up with Quakers was torn down, and he and a mob burst into his home and attacked him. Um, because why? Because he subscribed, to a northern newspaper and he taught black children how to read,
Yeah.
right? There's a real racial
Mhm.
motivation, right? In contrast to Lunsford's event, which seems to be more mixed in its motivations.
Yeah, and that whole
Very
chapter.
lengthy answers.
No, but that whole chapter was just so like they're they're threatening his life, right? You're going into the chapter and you're thinking, "Oh my God, this guy is going to be mutilated. He's going to be hurt. He's going to be like almost dying." And then they come and apologize. Hey, we didn't mean that. It's like it's
Oh,
almost
it's
like what
just so,
it feels surreal.
oh, it is. And their animosity doesn't subside. It subsides against him,
Yeah,
but then they roam town. They roam
right.
Raleigh for weeks, tearing up stuff and raising hell. And he had left, but
That's
I
also
mean, I think it's worth pointing out that one member of the mob left Raleigh with him on the same train, and every time the train stopped for a break, he would get off and scream at magistrates in whatever town they were in that this family was running away from slavery. He was trying to get them arrested. So there were members in the mob who were malicious in their
yeah,
intent,
yeah.
in their participation. I
Mhm.
don't want to, excuse the whole group. But collectively, they don't seem as determined to get Lunsford as to make a more political point.
Right.
That does not come out in the narrative. In the narrative, it's a personal attack on this singular individual. And that's where I find the narrative a bit distrustful, unrevealing. And so anyway, yeah. And
So,
I will say, going back to an earlier question, that the way I uncovered this was I found two diaries
mm,
where individuals wrote about what they saw happening in the town, right? And one was from a new minister in town, but the other one was from a member of the North Carolina Supreme Court.
mm,
And he's like, and both of them found the mob full of these terrible, poor
hmm
whites who, need to be
right.
taught a lesson, right?
Right.
But what they describe doesn't dovetail with the narrative, and that really raised questions for me about what was actually going on here.
Well, and I think it's sort of part of the story of the books that so many times you have individuals who say one thing publicly and do a whole different thing privately around Lunsford. Like whether it is Garrison or the members of this mob or the
Absolutely. And I think,
legislatures.
oh, I agree. And I think that evidences for us how political this time was in the
Hmm
United States,
Yeah.
that individuals had to take very public political stances on
hmm
issues that in private they didn't necessarily believe
Right.
or they did not act upon. And we sort of I think in our contemporary society, there are far few of us who have to be openly political about things. We can
hmm
retreat from politics. A
Right.
lot of us like to bury our heads in the sand during any given administration and presidential administration. But, you know, um, I think that was less
hmm
um, of an opportunity for a lot of people
Sure.
because the issue of slavery, in particular, forced everybody to find out where they stood,
Mhm.
right, and associate with others who stood in the same manner.
Yeah. So I think
I
we,
think that comes out in the book.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So I think we
yeah.
should briefly also talk about Benjamin Smith, since he is
No.
so. No, all right, we don't have to.
Oh
He,
no, we can't. He's the biggest conundrum in the story, isn't he?
yeah, because it's like he's such a helpful individual, it seems like, in that he kind of supports Lunsford in so many of his efforts. But then I kind of found the ends are so terrible on some level, right? Of like, oh, you still owe me money. Just ask Garrison for it, I think it was.
Smith well. So for your audience, Ben Smith was a merchant in Raleigh, and he actually makes the acquaintance of Lunsford's wife first. And Martha is in his Sunday school class at the Presbyterian Church, and it's through Benjamin Smith that Martha escapes the farm where she's enslaved, which is under a brutal overseer and she becomes part of his household. Um, becomes part of Benjamin Smith's household. And then Benjamin Smith befriends Lunsford, who at that time is courting Martha and eventually will marry her. And and Ben Smith becomes sort of the person who supports Lunsford
Mhm.
throughout the
Mhm.
rest of his enslaved time in Raleigh, and both financially and emotionally through Martha. Um, and Ben Smith is the person who takes Lunsford with him to New
Mhm.
York, where Lunsford gets his Emancipation Papers. So here's someone who's an ally,
Mhm.
um, but at the same time owns other
Yeah.
slaves,
Yeah.
clearly is participating in slavery as an
Yeah.
economic activity. Um, But then when Lunsford is arrested by the local county court in Raleigh,
Mhm.
you know, Ben Smith is there with bail money. It's just like I don't know what to make of it. And he's not alone. I
Mhm.
mean, there's four or five other men
Mhm.
um, in Raleigh, white men, doing this with for enslaved black men,
Mhm.
and um, and it really makes me wonder, how widespread this was across the enslaving states. I mean,
Mhm.
these are people who don't necessarily oppose slavery, but want to empower enslaved individuals and
Mhm.
help them find freedom. And in that regard, they're anti-slavery. I don't know, right? Um, and
Mhm.
um, you know, and I thought about that would be a fascinating study, but just imagine how absolutely terrifying that research would be, right? I mean, it would be nearly impossible to uncover that sort of broad way, um, beyond just maybe the ones I ran across in Raleigh. Um, but Ben Smith is fascinating, and it's um, and his position as a merchant in particular, and he built this huge
Mhm.
building for communal gatherings, right? And so he's sort of a community leader. So Lunsford attachment when he's a free black man in Raleigh to yet another powerful white man who has a lot of community status, you know. Yeah, but then as you pointed out, after Lunsford and his family escaped, Ben Smith asked for the bail money back,
Yeah.
and Lunsford apparently never sent it. Never. Ben Smith asked him several times, so kept writing him letters.
Yeah. Like, poor guy in that regard. But it would be fun, like if you could uncover like that guy's papers in some form. I mean,
Oh, I
that
know.
could be a treasure trove to dig through. Yeah, maybe hidden
Yeah,
somewhere in an attic.
well, yeah, you know. Or, clues to that are buried in people's, as you mentioned, personal papers, right?
Right.
And you'd have to read 1,000 letters to find
Right.
one reference to this type of
Right.
event. So again, there, doing this biography made me realize how much we don't know,
Mm-hmm. Oh
how
yeah.
very much we do not know as historians about the antebellum period,
Mm-hmm.
despite all the work that has been done.
Yeah.
There's so much we still have no clue about.
Yeah.
Yes.
So since you brought her up, let's talk about Marcer and Lucy.
Oh,
Um,
well, I've done a couple book talks and they've asked me about Lucy. Everybody wants to know about Lucy. And here's the bottom line about Lucy. I know nothing more than what I said in the book, which is Lunsford had a crush on this person, Lucy.
but it
She
must
was
have been
his
a
first love.
long-term crush because you bring her up again in Cambridgeport, I think, and
Oh, yes.
how is like
You
he's
know,
still thinking about her.
yes. And I think in the second half of the book, I'm pretty effective at showing how his relationship to Martha
Hmm.
begins to disintegrate over time.
Yeah.
And it sort of begins with this moment when Lunsford confesses in his narrative that his first love is Lucy Williams.
Right.
And I don't know who Lucy Williams was. I cannot find her in any records at all. I assume she was enslaved, but I cannot prove that. I do not know anything about her.
Hmm.
Lunsford, as you pointed out, um, remained infatuated for much of his life with her. And I'm sure this hurt Martha. Now, of course, I have no records from Martha or any of the children. None of them left anything behind
Hmm.
as historical sources. And so I don't know specifically what was going on within the family. And so a lot of what I distill from the records about what's happening with the family plays out in sort of transactional records, or is alluded to in newspaper accounts or whatever. Um, and so, but yeah, I can imagine, how Martha responded to this. And it truly is sort of, and the reason I think she did respond negatively is from that point forward, you begin to see Lunsford staying away from the home for longer
Mhm.
periods of time. He even moves to different cities without the family over the course of the next 25 years. Um, and there's this sort of disintegration that occurs. And so, yeah, um, that's another one, the William Miller story and Lucy Williams. I wish I could have found Lucy Williams. Um,
Oh, that
so,
would be
because it is sort of
yeah.
fascinating,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's like sort of us say talking about like a high school sweetheart, like or somebody you have a crush on in high school.
yeah,
And like it's like so long ago. Why would you bring this up?
yes. I mean, clearly he's emotionally attached to her,
Yeah.
bringing her up, um, that would have been what? 18 years after he
Right.
met her, at
Yeah.
least 18 years,
Yeah.
right? Um, so, uh, yeah, clearly Martha had to have some reaction to that.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I will say, but because you just said
So, Martha,
sorry, I had a lack of connection.
no, please go ahead.
Um, no, I kind of was going to say like where you said that you had very limited resources to tell the family story after they get to the Norse. It is incredible what you could tease out of those records because you can really see the family sort of breaking, how the alienation between father and the sons is taking place. Like you get a great sense actually of that, even if you can't pinpoint like what is causing it, but you get the sense like something in the family is not going right.
Oh, sure. And, one of the things I think any biographer wants to do is tap into the emotions
Hmm.
of their subjects. I will readily admit that's not part of this story because none of the subjects left anything behind that would attest to those emotions, right? And so what I was left with was sort of, and I actually had a calendar. I made basically month to month, year to year of their lives where I sort of laid out what was happening and tried to find parallel stories going on and trying to imagine how those stories interacted. And I'll give you an example of this is when Lunsford returned to Raleigh in 1865, two of his sons were coming south as well, right? But they clearly weren't coming with him. I mean, they accompanied him on the journey, but they were not going to go where he was going. He was off to start a freedman's plantation school. And they were not headed there. I don't know where they were going. And of course, their story, their journey southward is interrupted by this fight that takes place on the naval ship that they're all traveling on. And Lunsford sends them back home. Okay. So I don't know what those guys were doing. And it wasn't their first trip southward. Lunsford and Martha had twins, and the twins had come southward during the Civil War. Okay, they're not part of the military. One son did fight for the Union, but these two did not. But yet they're in South on the east coast of South Carolina as some sort of support network for the military. And I have to admit, I spent several years trying to uncover what type of support network they're engaged in and couldn't, right? I don't know what they're doing, right? But for two free young black men to travel into the Confederacy during the Civil War and risk that, you
Yeah.
have to wonder what exactly they were up to
Yeah.
and what they were hoping to gain from that. And those are
Mm,
questions left unanswered
mm,
because the sources just did not reveal um,
yeah.
their activities.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's just the reality. We can't ask these subjects of like, what were you doing? So
Right.
kind of like since we're getting towards the end slowly, we have still a little time, but I want to kind of briefly say like what was the most fascinating part for you personally when it came to sort of the being free, living in the Norse life of Lunsford? Was it sort of a specific moment, time of in a certain town that kind of stood out to you? What was sort of the most revealing moment, maybe?
Well, I will say, I think there's two moments in his story that emotionally touch me the most. The first, and this was early on in the research, is when I discovered when he died.
Mm,
A lot of historians had, well, nobody knew when he had died, and historians who claimed they knew had said it was in 1863
mm,
after the biography was written. But then I found him dying in Manhattan in 1879. And I sort of became obsessed for a while with where he was buried. And then
mm,
I found this reference in a New York newspaper that he was buried in New York Bay. And I thought they just threw his body in the bay. Is that normal? And then I thought, there's an island in New York Bay where the bodies of destitute people have been buried for centuries.
mm,
And so I began to try to explore there. But then I discovered there's a cemetery called New York Bay Cemetery, right, over in Jersey City. And I head over
mm,
there and pull up the card. They had an index card system from the 19th century. And they pull it up, and there he was with Martha. They're not buried beside each other. There's plots between them, but there he is with his wife, right?
mm.
And so I'm excited, and I'm going out to the plot of land where he's buried, eager to see the headstone. And of course,
Okay.
there are no headstones because the family couldn't afford it, right? And it really struck me hard that
Mm,
this was a person who I have a relationship with right at this point who's been erased. The memory is entirely gone here,
mm,
and that struck me really hard.
mm,
But something that hit me even harder is there's this moment after Lunsford gets to New England for the first time when he's going
mm,
to raise money for his family, um, and and um, and he took his eldest daughter with him Laura, and they're in Springfield, Massachusetts, and it's the middle of a snowstorm, and they're in a carriage, and it pulls up in front of an inn,
mm,
and it's dark, and the innkeeper comes out and grabs the girl out of the carriage to carry her in, and as he
mm,
approaches the interior of the building, the light shows that she's a black girl, and he dumps her on the
mm,
ground, right, and tells them they can't stay there, and to me, that was that was a really hard reminder that racism in the North was just as powerful as racism in the South. It may not have been as institutionalized or as legalized as it was in the South, but it was just as powerful. And he roams Springfield looking for somebody to help for hours, and he finally finds someone. But it's a really hard reminder of what the United States looked like um, everywhere. So yes. So those were moments that really touched me and made me think more deeply about what I was doing in the book and what I wanted to say about Lunsford's legacy.
yeah, and those two did stand out to me too because it kind of was that a sort of I was thinking in as a parent in that moment of like you're in a foreign unknown place. You just got
Mm.
told you can't be somewhere and you want to protect your children from this adverse weather. But so you just sort of like I was also thinking like here's an old man living in a small room in New York, like a person that was famous with the abolitionist movement for a few years and he just total obscurity.
Right. And he becomes obscure, probably a decade before he dies.
Yeah.
He just becomes forgotten.
Hmm.
And, he gave a speech every now and then at a picnic or some sort of communal event.
Right.
But by the 1870s, he has disappeared from
Hmm.
abolitionist memory. Even former speaking partners on the abolitionist circuit don't include him in their memoirs or
Hmm.
in history books that they're writing about black abolitionists. And he's totally dismissed. And it really is tragic because
Hmm.
um, he ends up in this tenement building in New York alone. And you can just imagine, because I have no sources, right? I mean, I know he's in the tenement building. I
Hmm.
know the people who lived in the building with him. A
Right.
lot of them are formerly enslaved people who escaped the South and are trying to make their way in New York City.
Hmm.
And you can just imagine, that he lives this sort of um, lonely because his family is now disconnected from him, this sort of lonely, wandering existence in New York. And I try to lay out, what could he have been doing?
Yeah.
He probably, he would hear Frederick Douglass was going to speak at a local church, and he probably went to see him, maybe making a connection with somebody he knew. Um, or he maybe told his story over and over again to people who just didn't want to hear it, right? Which seems to be, the nature of New York,
Right.
walking the streets of New York, right? Even today, is that you hear a lot you don't want to hear,
Yeah.
right? And so, I think that's it's really a sad
Mhm.
story, the end of his life, and the fact um, that he's buried without any pomp,
Mhm.
without any notice. There's
Mhm.
no notice of his burial in the newspapers. There's no funeral service, apparently. He's
Mhm.
just put into the ground.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, kind of as you were talking, and this is going to be the final question for today. Um, as you were talking, I kind of was thinking of like in many ways, sort of the forgetting of Lunsford mirrors the abolition movement because after 65, for a lot of them, Garrison included, it's sort of like well, slavery's over, it's done, we're finished, right? And they're kind of like they're dismissing somewhat that human element that what do you do with people that have their entire lifetime been enslaved and are now being kind of at the mercy of their former masters in an extremely racist and economically desolate situation.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's two things going on here. The first is that there's this transition of the
Hmm.
abolitionist into people who are trying to affect freedom for
Hmm.
former enslaved peoples. And so Lunsford's actually part of that in 1865 when he wants to start the plantation school. He's trying to help formerly enslaved people down near New Bern, North Carolina. Okay. But that doesn't last a year, and then he's out of that process. There are plenty of abolitionists who, or former abolitionists, who do continue
Hmm.
that sort of work, both in the North and in the South. Okay. But I think for Lunsford's story, the more important thing happening here is that at the end of the Civil War, we begin to see former abolitionists begin to frame their history, right? They begin writing histories of abolitionism. They're trying to
Hmm.
frame it in certain ways,
Yeah.
cast it in certain ways that look as if this was the goal all along. William Hawkins is one of those, the guy who writes Lunsford's biography. In Lunsford's biography, he editorializes about this was the purpose of the Civil War the entire time, and so there's this effort to write history in a certain way by many of these abolitionists. Lunsford's participation in abolitionism never fit that
Right.
narrative,
Yeah.
right? So in many ways, he was not an abolitionist. He never grabbed the title abolitionist for himself. Um, in many ways, Lunsford was, and I hate to put it so trite, an entertainer. Right. He was a storyteller who told a good story. He used the
Mhm.
abolitionist circuit to tell that story,
Mhm.
but he wasn't out there denouncing slavery. He was trying, and in fact, his argument that we should be purchasing enslaved people
Mhm.
and not waiting to convince all of the United States that slavery is wrong
Mhm.
really flew in the face of the most powerful members of the abolitionist movement. And so Lunsford's place in abolitionism was problematic to begin with, and he was summarily erased from it by those who remembered abolitionism.
And
And so, yeah, it's a tragic end to a life,
yeah,
and to a
and
story. Yeah.
yeah, and a very, I would almost want to argue, common end at this time to stories of that nature with people who didn't fit in
Oh,
to.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But I would add that's also the case in our current. I
Yeah,
mean, that's always the case,
always.
right?
Yeah.
There are people who disappear from our historical narratives all the time. And one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story, one of the things I realized that I was doing as I was writing this story is making the case that historical actors don't have to be activists,
Mm-hmm.
don't have to display agency, even though he
Yeah.
does both of these things a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But in his own living of his life and in his persisting,
Mm-hmm.
right, his story is worth knowing
Yeah.
and relating to because he's more human than a lot of our historical figures, to go back to an earlier theme from our conversation. And he's somebody that I can identify with a little bit, and I hope most readers can identify with him a little bit. So, yeah,
Well, now you just made the argument that I should go back to that initial biography I had in mind to write for my dissertation.
you should. You should. We
Uh,
need more biographies in vogue right now, and we need more biography
yeah.
of people who we don't need another biography of John Adams.
No, we do
We need
not.
more biography of people who had an impact, not necessarily on the globe or on the nation, but on other individuals
Yeah.
and empowered and inspired them in ways that we have yet to really acknowledge.
Yeah, I agree. So,
Yeah.
as we are at the end of our time together today, just as a reminder for those still listening to us, this was Becoming Lunsford Lane, The Lives of an American Aeneas, University of North Carolina Press. Um, Craig, thank you so much for taking this hour and a half this morning or this afternoon for you. No,
Yeah.
it's still morning.
This
And
morning.
sharing some of the insights that you uncovered with Lansford.
Well, I'm delighted that you invited me, and I appreciate the time with you. And thank you very much for the questions. They were well informed, and I appreciate them.
I tried to read the book.
Good. That's what it's all about.
All
So
right. Thank you.
thank you again.